Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian. Nice to have you back. Today we're going to be talking about the time frame of Section 64 through Section 66 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And the reason why I say that is because we've got 6 meetings that we'll be exploring those minutes from those meetings. We have an unpublished revelation. We have a license to William Smith. Lots of extra stuff. And as we go forward with this, by the way, there's going to be a lot less sections of the Doctrine and Covenants and a lot more of this extra stuff. And I'm going to try to fill in that history the best I can. But without going into a lot of the nitty-gritty details, as I have been doing on the sections, which is what I'm really focusing on to try to fill in the history of the revelations that we currently have printed in Scripture. So, yeah, welcome back. We're going to have a long parts 1 and 2. Part 3 will be kind of short, but this is going to be section 64 through 66. And before we get to that, we get a slip of paper belonging to John Burke. This is going to be a revelation that was actually held by him. So this is in the handwriting of John Whitmer, and the Burke family kept it for many, many years and gave it to the church back just in 1994, so not very long ago. As you can see, kind of a small scrap of paper. The historical introduction to this is from the Documents, Volume 1, says, on August 31, 1831, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation instructing 3 church members, John Burke, Erastus Babbitt, and David Elliott, to travel to the land of Zion in the fall of that year. The revelation was probably dictated in Kirtland, Ohio, where Joseph Smith had dictated another revelation the day before. The 31st August revelation did not provide further information about what the 3 men were to do in Missouri, whether they were to relocate or just visit, or what prompted this instruction, nor did Joseph Smith provide any background to the revelation. So this is, as it is, a scrap of paper, not a whole lot going on here. So who are these guys? Well, the historical introduction gives us this. Burke, Babbitt, and Elliott had mechanical skills that may have been useful in Missouri as the saints strove to build the city of Zion. Babbitt was a carpenter and millwright, Elliott was a blacksmith, and Burke may have been trained in sawmill operations. This 31 August revelation may be an instance of Joseph Smith acting on the promise from the previous day's revelation that the Lord would give power to Joseph Smith, quote, to discern by the Spirit those who shall go up unto the land of Zion, and those of my disciples that shall tarry. It appears, however, that none of the men followed the revelation's instructions immediately. So a great revelation, but apparently they didn't quite do it. And I find it interesting that this would be akin to what we do today, which we still do today, which is, as we would say, service missions. You know, you have some sort of a skill set that you use. We do this a lot with doctors and with people like this, people who are carpenters, millwrights, blacksmiths, and things like that, to go to certain areas to be of service. So it's kind of interesting that we, kind of still do that to this day. Further into the historical introduction, we get the scribe for the original manuscript of this revelation is unknown, but copies may have been made for each recipient. The only extant copy, which Burke retained in his possession, is in John Whitmer's handwriting. So it would make sense if you got a revelation, you get a copy of it, move on with it. So, yeah. Footnote 5 to the historical introduction says, in October 1831 and January 1832, Burke purchased land in Kirtland Township. Records indicate that Babbitt, meanwhile, was still in Kirtland in October 1831. In January 1832, Oliver Cowdery requested that Elliott and Babbitt relocate to Missouri, indicating they still had not gone. Burke eventually moved to Clay County, Missouri, and Elliott moved there in 1838, but it does not appear that Babbitt ever relocated. Apparently stayed in Ohio. So it's a very short revelation, so I'll just read it off to you. It says, behold, thus saith the Lord by the voice of the Spirit, it is wisdom in me that my servant John Burke, David Elliott, Erastus Babbitt, should take their journey this fall to the land of Zion, given August 31, 1831, by Joseph the Seer. And the Joseph Smith papers give us no footnotes for this little scrap of paper. So, pretty quick. And there you have it. So next thing we're going to get into is content from a meeting. This is from Minute Book 2, and this is a kind of an intense conference of people that got together. So here you go from Minute Book 2. This is from the 1st of September, 1831. This is a meeting that they had. It says, Brother Newell K. Whitney was ordained an agent unto the disciples in this land under the hand of Brother Oliver Cowdery. Upon testimony given satisfactorily to this conference, it was voted that our brethren Edison Fuller and William Carter be silenced from holding the office of elders in this church. By request of Brother Loren Page, the conference received his license as a priest. So apparently you got two guys being, as we would call it today, advanced in the priesthood, and two others who are being silenced, or they're sort of taking things away. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, a lot of like, I guess a little bit of dissent in a way, if you will. Footnote 2 for this says, an early convert in Kirtland, Fuller had engaged in what many considered to be spiritual excesses. One account claimed that Fuller, while lying on the floor, has been seen to jump up and cling to a beam for a while, and then drop like a log on the floor. This same account stated that Fuller and others received their commission to preach on a roll of paper handed to them from above, rather than from a group of elders as outlined in the Articles and Covenants of the Church. On the 6th of June, 1831, Fuller was called in a revelation to travel to Zion with Jacob Scott. Along the way, Scott, quote, threw down the Book of Mormon and jumped on it and said he would go to hell before he would preach it, unquote. So, they don't seem to be into the missionary thing, to say the least. So, we get this. Actually this is a footnote, but it's actually from the History of the Reorganized Church. Once again, my highest praise for them and for the wonderful record keeping that they did. But we get this. Little is known about Carter, but he was also called in the 6th June revelation to travel to Zion in company with Wheeler Baldwin. When that transpired is not entirely clear. A late 19th century history states that Jacob Scott, Fuller, and Carter apostatized and refused to go to Zion. Jared Carter wrote in 1833 that David Johnson, whom Fuller had baptized about summer 1831, requested rebaptism because Fuller had been under the influence of an evil spirit when he performed Johnson's baptism. In a copy of minutes from June 1831 conference that Ebenezer Robinson included in Minute Book 2, Denied the Faith appears next to both Fuller's and Carter's names. These parenthetical redactions were probably added after the creation of the original document. Yeah, so we got problems down there in River City, and Minute Book 2 explains those things. But again, high praise. Thank you so much for at the time, the RLDS Church History that gave us that. Footnote 4 we get, apparently the conference withdrew Fuller and Carter's authority to preach as elders in the church, probably by taking their elders' licenses. According to Webster's 1828 dictionary, to silence meant, quote, to restrain from preaching by revoking a license to preach. So they were using contemporary language for that. So it wasn't anything more than just like, I'm taking your license away from you. You don't get to drive anymore, so to speak, in our language today. So we get some content from the 6th of April meeting minutes. From Minute Book 2, we get this. Minutes of conference held in Nilson Portage County, Ohio, September 6, 1831. Elders present, Joseph Smith Jr., Oliver Cowdery, Christian Whitmer, Sidney Rigdon, Sylvester Parker, denied the faith. Upon testimony satisfactory to this conference, it was voted that Ezra Booth be silenced from preaching as an elder in this church. Oliver Cowdery, clerk of conference, I think is what that means, just in abbreviations. So here's another meeting on the 6th of September, a couple of days later, and Ezra Booth is out of there. So Ezra actually makes quite a lot of very wonderful contributions to the Joseph Smith papers in a way. So we'll get to that now. So from, again, Documents Volume 1, the historical introduction, on September 6, 1831, Joseph Smith and other church elders disciplined Ezra Booth during a conference in Nilson, Ohio. A former Methodist minister, Booth had joined the church in February 1831. Booth was ordained to the high priesthood at the conference held in Kirtland, Ohio in early June 1831, and received a commission in a subsequent June revelation to travel to Missouri with Isaac Morley, preaching along the way. Although he reluctantly fulfilled this assignment, he became increasingly disillusioned with Joseph Smith while in Missouri. On 8th of August, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation commanding Booth and others to return to Ohio, proclaiming the gospel as they did so. Booth later recalled that he, quote, violated the commandment by not preaching, unquote, on his journey home. But he accused Joseph Smith of neglecting the same commandment. So basically being like, yeah, I didn't preach by the way, but Joseph, neither did you, right? So that's kind of a legit thing if true, very legitimate. Further into this, after Booth reached Ohio on the 1st of September, he had several interviews with Messrs. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery to discuss his belief that Mormonism was, quote, nothing else than a deeply laid plan of craft and deception, unquote. These interviews may have taken place in the few days leading up to this conference. A later Joseph Smith history states that Joseph Smith spent, quote, the forepart of September preparing to move to Hiram, Ohio, which may have necessitated a trip there. Ezra Booth was apparently living in Nilson, and since Nilson was just a few miles from Hiram, Joseph Smith and others could have met with Booth at his home at this time. Although the minutes are not clear, it is possible that this conference took place directly after such a meeting. Since the conference prohibited Booth from preaching as an elder in this church, 5 days after another conference had disciplined 2 other men in Kirtland, within a few days Booth began writing a series of letters critical of Joseph Smith and the church. The letters were soon published in the Ohio Star, a newspaper in Ravenna, Ohio, with the announced intent, quote, to prevent the spread of a delusion, unquote. Another newspaper in the area reported that Booth publicly renounced Mormonism at a camp meeting held in Shalersville, Ohio, later in the month. So this was definitely his choice. And footnote 3 expands on this just a little bit. It says, Booth was disappointed with several developments, including the small number of converts he found in Missouri, and his inability to preach the gospel with the same spirit and liberty he had experienced as a Methodist preacher. Booth recounted that before leaving Ohio for Missouri, Joseph Smith stated that he had been shown in a vision a great church that Oliver Cowdery had raised up in Missouri, consisting of, quote, several hundred converts, far more than the few members Booth found upon his arrival. There is no extant account of such a vision, nor is there any reference to this vision in other sources. Booth also resented having to walk to Missouri, while Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and others received money to travel by other means. Furthermore, Booth said that he regarded Joseph Smith's spirit of lightness and levity, a temper of mind easily irritated, and a habitual proneness to jesting and joking as unbecoming a prophet. However, having said that, Ezra Booth is a very huge figure in church historical documentation. A lot of his anti-Mormon writings, especially through Mormonism Unveiled, actually give us a lot of our footnotes and fill out a lot more of the story that we have today. So kind of thank you, Ezra Booth. I think a bit of that honesty is very necessary. There's some of these things like, this vision of, hey, there's all these people there, and he gets there and that vision falls on its face. I have to assume that, there could have been revelations or other things that Joseph Smith did that weren't recorded. So I'm not dismissing this out of hand, but there's no current proof of it that it ever happened. But that's Ezra Booth. So that's the end of his membership in the church. He was actually a pretty big figure in the Ohio and Missouri missions, and then left shortly thereafter. But we do get a lot of cool stuff out of it. So, there's that. All right, so moving on to section 64, and that'll be the end of this part. So this section 64, it was kind of funny. I was going through this and started realizing that this is kind of another end of an era. This is the very last thing you get in the Book of Commandments. So this is the end of the Book of Commandments for us. So if you want to kind of know where it stops, this is where it stops. We get more in the Doctrine and Covenants, but anyway, there's also a very interesting appendix in the Joseph Smith papers about the Book of Commandments that we'll explore just for a moment. So we'll get to this in a second, but the first copy that we have is in Revelation Book 1. It's in the handwriting of John Whitmer. It is termed a revelation instead of a commandment, and we get verse numbering from W.W. Phelps. A lot of the editions that we get, were kind of fun out of this, are actually in the hand of Joseph Smith himself. So we get last name editions from a few people. So we have Isaac Morley, Ezra Booth, Edward Partridge, and himself. He actually adds Smith Jr. here. In addition, we get a couple of lines of text, which is kind of an interesting thing, which is usually done by Sidney Rigdon or others, but we get this. So we get until the coming of the Son of Man. So the whole phrase is, field now is called today, until the coming of the Son of Man. Those words were added by Joseph Smith after the fact. This one that is very famous in the church today, he that is tithed shall not be burned. And then Joseph says, at his coming. That is a very oft quoted scripture, but he that is tithed shall not be burned at his coming. That little addition there at the end was in the hand of Joseph Smith, which is kind of fun. The third one we get is, this is the Lord's business, Joseph adds, and he hath set you to provide for his saints in these last days. And then we also get that the inhabitants of Zion shall judge all things, and then Joseph says, pertaining to Zion. So a lot of clarifications that are rather important here. There is an editing mark that ought to be noted here. As you can see, it's kind of surrounding the word Ephraim, which is the end of this gathering and what was actually bound into a book. And that, my friends, in the middle of that sentence, is the end of the Book of Commandments. So if you've forgotten, there's a previous episode where I went into this in detail. But the printing press in 1833 was attacked by a mob. I mean, they razed it to the ground. They took the roof off. They busted the windows out. They threw the printing press out. All the furniture went with it. And they tried to burn as many of the copies as they could. And there was a couple of young women who went into the woods and actually saved the gatherings that were printed. And that's what you have in the Book of Commandments. But if you want to know, in mid-sentence, this was the last thing they were able to get off the press before it was attacked. So that now one kind of snuck up on me. But yeah, that's the end of that. So what you get here is chapter 65 in the Book of Commandments. And this is a partial copy because it ends on the word Ephraim, just as it is in Revelation book 1. And so that's the end of that. So we will put the Book of Commandments on the shelf. Before we do that, I wanted to pull it off the shelf just to kind of show you something that, again, I just wanted to give very high praise to this. So the copy of the Book of Commandments that I have is a reproduction that was actually done by the Reorganized Church. And I say the Reorganized Church before the Community of Christ because, according to our publishing date here, it was actually printed in 1972. So this little edition that I have goes back to 1972 before the name change. And what I love about it is that they had the Revelation book 1. And when I first read this many years ago, this is actually, again, I've been showing you these digital copies, but that Ephraim they show is where the Book of Commandments ends. And so the reorganization did a really, really great job of publishing this and kind of giving a history of what this little book is. So again, I might be gushing too much about these people, but I just can't say enough about how well they've done with record keeping, with preserving such important documents to so many people. So anyway, thank you for your service on the Book of Commandments. And this little book kind of started me on this church history journey. So I have to give credit where it's due. So now the Community of Christ, but whatever you may call yourselves, wonderful people. Thank you very much for what you've done. So that's the end of the Book of Commandments. So we're going to say sayonara to that. Just want to show you that. A little gushing there, a little gratitude. Very grateful because keeping histories is not an easy task. So anyway, but that's the end of that. So it is section 64 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, full copy there. We also get a copy that was in the possession of Newell K. Whitney. It is in the handwriting of John Whitmer, very flowery handwriting at the very end that says Hiram and to Newell K. Whitney. But this is a copy of the Revelation written by John Whitmer, but it was in Newell K. Whitney's papers, which were later donated to the church. So we get a copy there, which is very nice. We'll get into the introduction on that, what it offers. There's also a copy in Sidney Gilbert's notebook. We've seen this one before. There's also a copy in the Hyde Smith notebook, which is Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith. It actually starts in the handwriting of Samuel Smith, and then it keeps going for the rest of the time in Orson Hyde's handwriting. So you can see the difference between the two. I imagined when I first read this, I was like, it's like, holy cow, dude, your handwriting is huge. Let me take over, and we're going to shrink the handwriting down so we can fit more on a page. But anyway, I'm making that up. Just amateur historian being a dork over here. But anyway, we also have Edward Partridge's Book of Commandments. And as I was first looking at this, I was wondering, like, why am I looking at a different Book of Commandments? What's the big deal? And what he does is really cool. If you flip over the page here, he writes in the rest of the Revelation on, kind of the paper left over and completes the Revelation. So I thought that was really cool. This is Edward Partridge's handwriting, and he kind of fills in the history himself. I thought that was really, really wonderful. We also get a copy of this revelation in the manuscript history, which we'll get to in a moment as well. And with all of this, with all this really important stuff, there is no difference of any kind between 1981 and 2013, except for the removal of the history of the church reference. Everything else is exactly the same. So I thought that was kind of remarkable. We really don't mention how significant this was to the Book of Commandments, which I don't know, maybe we're just trying to keep it to what the revelations are instead. So anyway, so further introductions to this from Revelation Book 1, we get 67 Revelation, Kirtland, September 11th, 1831. Directions to the elders, etc., etc. 11 etceteras. So that's from Revelation Book 1. The John Whitmer copy that we have, again, this is in the possession of Newell K. Whitney, simply gives given at Kirtland, September 11th, 1831. So not much there. Sidney Gilbert's copy is very brief as well. It says received at Kirtland, 12 or 11, September 1831. Right. The Smith Hyde notebook gives us a little teeny bit more. It says a commandments. Not a revelation. A commandment given at Kirtland, September 11th, 1831. And because this is our very last chapter of the Book of Commandments, I give you this from there. It says, a revelation to the elders of the church given in Kirtland, Ohio, September 1831. And thank you very much, Book of Commandments. That'll be the last one of those. Again, just the same. Revelation and time and the Doctrine and Covenants, not much there. So what we do get from the manuscript history is this. The forepart of September was spent in making preparations to remove to the town of Hiram and recommence the translation of the Bible. The brethren who were commanded to go up to Zion were earnestly engaged in getting ready to start in the coming October. On the 11th of September, I received the following revelation given in Kirtland, September 1842, 1831. So, anyway, mistakes made there. So, making preparations to move to Hiram. So, lots of hurt feelings surrounding this one. A lot of intense feelings leading up to this revelation. So, we get this from the Historical Introduction, Documents, Volume 1 from the Joseph Smith Papers. Joseph Smith dictated a revelation in Kirtland, Ohio on 11th of September, 1831, just a few days after arriving back from Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. Although the Missouri trip involved the identification of the site for the city of Zion and the dedication of land for the construction of a temple, it generated disappointment and disillusion for some. Despite high expectations, Oliver Cowdery and his companions had been unsuccessful in their attempts to preach to the American Indians, or Lamanites, west of the Missouri border. Their subsequent efforts among the white population of Jackson County, Missouri, yielded little success. Disappointment also stemmed from the designation of Independence, a rough frontier village, as the center place for the city of Zion. Ezra Booth, one of the elders called to travel to Missouri in the summer of 1831, also expressed disillusionment with Joseph Smith himself. Booth complained that he and his companion Isaac Morley had to walk to Missouri while Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and other church leaders traveled by way of stagecoach and canal. Apparently, Booth witnessed a confrontation between Edward Partridge and Joseph Smith over the quality of Missouri land selected for purchase. Booth believed that Joseph Smith's conduct in these disagreements was unbecoming a Christian. Rigdon, likely referring to the same incident, placed the blame on Partridge, stating he had insulted the prophet in particular and assumed authority over him in open violation of the laws of God. Partridge was later penitent. The same minutes that contain Rigdon's accusation record Partridge saying that, quote, if Brother Joseph has not forgiven him, he hopes he will, as he is and has always been sorry, unquote. Booth, on the other hand, apparently became more resentful, and a conference barred him from preaching as an elder in the church on the 6th of September, 1831. And we've already talked about those minutes. Further to this, a week later, this 11th September revelation expounded on the necessity of forgiveness and specifically referred to problems involving Booth, Morley, and Partridge, indicating that the latter two were more forgiven for their sins. It also discussed preparation for the gathering to Missouri. The revelation clarified the relationship between Kirtland and Missouri. A previous revelation had established Independence as the center place at which to build the city of Zion, and this revelation declared that Kirtland, where the saints had previously gathered, would remain a stronghold for 5 years. It also identified what property should be retained in Kirtland, portraying a bright future for the land of Zion. The revelation offered encouragement to those who remained committed to the mission and leadership of Joseph Smith. So, yeah, some fighting words going on here and some hurt feelings. Very stressful time. And I'm just going to kind of remind everybody that's listening here, most of these guys are in their like 20s and 30s. So this is not like a bunch of old people fighting. This is, everybody's still pretty young. And so I think that kind of contributes to the fact that there's a lot of energy going on with this right now. So some content and footnotes from the Revelation. We get this from the Revelation itself. It says, I have given unto you the kingdom, and the keys of the mysteries of the kingdom shall not be taken from my servant Joseph while he liveth, inasmuch as he obeyeth mine ordinances. Footnote 5 to this says, according to a September 1830 revelation, the Lord had given Joseph Smith the keys of the mysteries of the revelations which are sealed until I shall appoint unto him another in his stead. A December 1830 revelation similarly proclaimed that Joseph Smith had, quote, the keys of the mystery of those things which have been sealed. If he abide in me, and if not, another will I plant in his stead. And this is a very interesting thing about a leader, especially that young. There's a lot of room here for Joseph to, die and have to, church moves on to something else, or that Joseph could blow it and actually lose his position as the leader of the church. So, and as the prophet. So it's a very interesting language here in these revelations and in these footnotes. So the text gives us a little further down. There are those who have sought occasion against him without a cause. Nevertheless, he hath sinned, but verily I say unto you, I the Lord forgiveth sins unto those who confess their sins before me, and ask forgiveness, who have not sinned unto death. My disciples in days of old sought occasion against one another, and forgave not one another in their hearts. And for this evil they were afflicted and sorely chastened. Wherefore I say unto you, that ye ought to forgive one another. Now, footnote 6 to this clarifies some wording. The word occasion here means opportunity of attacking, of fault-finding, or of giving or taking offense. The copy of the Revelation made by Samuel Smith and Orson Hyde has accusation rather than occasion. So, if you want, you can replace accusation with occasion in this particular case. And this is a reference back, just for full disclosure, this is a reference back to the New Testament where you have the apostles during, I believe it was during the Last Supper, sort of arguing with who was the greatest in the kingdom of God. And Jesus sort of said, no, the servant is the greatest, right? So that's a reference back to that in the New Testament. The Revelation further says, Behold, I the Lord was angry with him who was my servant Ezra Booth, and also my servant Isaac Morley. For they kept not the law, neither the commandment. They sought evil in their hearts, and I the Lord withheld my spirit. They condemned for evil that thing in which there was no evil. So what are we talking about? Footnote 14 to this says, a June 1831 revelation assigned Booth and Morley to travel to Missouri together, preaching the word by the way. Booth later complained that the Spirit did not enable him to speak with as great liberty as he expected on this trip. Exactly how Booth and Morley had defied the February 1831 revelation known as the laws of the Church of Christ is unclear. So when it says kept not the law, it's referring to this laws. It was a revelation, an earlier revelation. And so not really quite clear about what that was because the minutes are pretty brief. So there you go. So reading further in, the text gives us, and again, I say unto you that my servant Isaac may not be tempted above that which he is able to bear, and counsel wrongfully to your hurt. I have given commandment that this farm should be sold. I willeth not that my servant Frederick G. Williams should sell his farm. So what are we talking about? Footnote 17. Joseph Smith and Emma Smith had been living on Morley's farm since April 1831. A 30th of August revelation told Titus Billings, Morley's brother-in-law, to whom Morley had given power of attorney in June, to, quote, dispose of the land and send the resulting money unto the land of Zion unto them whom I have appointed to receive. Approximately 80 acres of Morley's land was sold in October 1831 to Ritchie and Hercules Carrel. Hercules. Great name. So further into the text we get, I the Lord requireth the hearts of the children of men. Behold, now it is called today, and verily it is a day of sacrifice, and a day for the tithing of my people. For he that is tithed shall not be burned, for after today cometh the burning. This is speaking after the manner of the Lord. For verily I say, tomorrow all the proud, and they that do wickedly, shall be as stubble, and I will burn them up, saith the Lord, for I am the Lord of hosts. Footnote 20 to this. Very interesting, I thought. No set process for tithing members of the church was in place at this time. Instead, the laws of the Church of Christ instructed members to consecrate their property to the church and receive back an inheritance. Over a year later, Joseph Smith stated in a letter to William W. Phelps that consecration was a way that God tithed his people. It is contrary to the will, I'll do that again. Quote, it is contrary to the will and commandment of God that those who receive not the inheritance by consecration agreeable to this law, which he has given, that he may tithe his people to prepare them against the day of vengeance and burning, should have their names enrolled with the people of God, unquote. And this is the joke in the modern church is fire insurance. That's why we pay our tithing. As a personal note, that's not why I do it, but I think it's kind of a silly idea. But it is definitely, there are a lot of references to this tithing being a protection against, this fire that should be coming, this burning that should be coming. So a little further down in the Revelation, we continue to get, behold, the Lord requireth the hearts and a willing mind, and the willing and obedient shall eat the good of the land of Zion in these last days. And the rebellious shall be cut off out of the land of Zion, and shall be sent away, and shall not inherit the land. For verily I say that the rebellious are not of the blood of Ephraim, wherefore they shall be plucked out. So why Ephraim? Footnote 28. Ephraim was one of the two sons of Joseph, son of Jacob, in the Old Testament. In discussing the duties of the elders of my church in early August 1831 Revelation, echoed language from Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 17, referring to the blessings pronounced by Moses on the tribe of Joseph. In October 1831, a revelation for William E. McClellan stated that he was, quote, a true descendant from Joseph, who was sold unto Egypt down through the loins of Ephraim, his son, unquote. In November 1831, Revelation clarified that the children of Ephraim were God's servants who would help gather the scattered tribes of Israel to Zion before the second coming of Jesus Christ. So that's a pretty big promise, and something I believe is pretty well known in the church to this day is this idea that the tribe of Ephraim is in charge of gathering in. And this is a reference back to the Old Testament when Joseph was the one who brought his family to safety inside of Egypt during the famine. And so I won't go too far into that, but this is usually a big conversation whenever somebody gets their patriarchal blessing. And especially if they're of the tribe of Ephraim or Manasseh or whatever tribe that they're from, there's these certain promises that are associated with it. So you'll see that reference to Ephraim quite a lot in Latter-day Saint literature. So our last quotation here from a content gives us this. And even the judge and his counselors, if they are not faithful in their stewardship, shall be condemned, and others shall be planted in their stead. Again, this idea, if you don't do your job right, you're going to be removed or relieved of duty. Footnote 31 to this says, in an August 1831 letter, Partridge commented to his wife, Lydia, that, quote, as I am occasionally chastened, I sometimes feel as though I must fall, unquote. Very humble man, very poor guy. He keeps getting kind of beat up and he keeps kind of blaming himself. And apparently Ezra Booth was very upset by that. So one of the reasons why he left the church. So that is the end of our section here, section 64. I did want to mention something here that is an interesting essay inside of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. You're going to see this in the Revelations and Translations section, especially about the Book of Commandments. So there is a section in here called what is the proposed sixth gathering of the Book of Commandments. So again, we're cut off mid-sentence, right? It says the word Ephraim, and that's the end of that, and we don't get any more because it was destroyed in this thing. They didn't get to actually print those things. So something we get here is their best guess, and there's some pretty solid research behind this, which I'll get to in a moment, about what would have been in the very last gathering and in the very last portion of the Book of Commandments. After that, who knows? But at least we know there was one more gathering that was planned. And we're getting a lot of this from Revelation Book 1 and some other things. So anyway, I'll just read off this from the historical introduction to this proposed sixth gathering. It says, "The Book of Commandments, as it exists today, is incomplete. When angry residents of Jackson County, Missouri, razed the printing office operated by William W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, and John Whitmer in July of 1833, sheets from only the first 5 gatherings of the book were salvaged. While it is possible, even unlikely, or even likely, that typesetting or printing of an additional gathering had begun, no known copy of such a gathering exists." So I did an entire episode again about this, about the young woman who saved these gatherings, and that's the reason why you have it today. But the Joseph Smith papers has determined, due to printers' markings, things like verse numberings, and what could have been in this sixth gathering of the Book of Commandments. So what's in there? And if you want to read it, go to the website, buy the book. It's all in there. I'm just gonna kind of give you the cliff notes here, the amateur historian notes here. What would have been included? Well, the rest of section 64, which I think is kind of obvious. And then it would have been section 66, then section 65. Flip those. Then section 68, 67, and 69. So out of order there as well. 68, 7, and 9. You would have received a partial copy of section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So we're skipping way ahead now. But this is, I'm sorry, these numbers are based on current revelations. So you had, again, a partial of 107. Then it would have been 70, 71, 72, and 73. No 74. You get section 75. You get section 133. And that's the end of it. So just so you know. 64, 6, 5, 8, 67, 69, 107, 70 through 73, 75, and 133. Just those are the smattering of things that would have been included in this last gathering. And this is based on just research of print numberings, take marks, things like that were inside of the Revelation books. The last thing you would have gotten was a testimony of witnesses. And we have a copy of this, or what we think would have been in there. So I'm just going to read this because I think it's kind of interesting. It says, "The testimony of witnesses. The testimony of the witnesses to the book of the Lord's commandments, which he gave to his church through Joseph Smith, Jr., who was appointed by the voice of the church for this purpose. We, the undersigners, feel willing to bear testimony to all the world of mankind, to every creature upon the face of all the earth, and upon the islands of the sea, that God hath borne record to our souls through the Holy Ghost, shed forth upon us, that these commandments were given by inspiration of God, and are profitable for all men, and are verily true. We give this testimony unto the world, the Lord being our helper, and it is through the grace of God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ that we are permitted to have this privilege of bearing this testimony unto the world, in the which we rejoice exceedingly, praying the Lord always that the children of men may be profited thereby. Amen." And if that doesn't sound familiar at all to you, the last time they did this was for the witness pages of the Book of Mormon. So there's a lot of familiar language here, and Oliver Cowdery is once again involved. So kind of a fun thing, but that would have been the witness page. Again, it would have been in the back of the book, just like with the Book of Mormon. Footnote 14 shows that all of this actually comes from the Revelation book. So this version is based on the version in Revelation Book 1, page 121. A version of this testimony without the signatures was published in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants as, quote, "the written testimony of the 12," unquote. The punctuation of the text is based on that 1835 version. So there you go. So this is what it looks like. Revelation Book 1, page 121. This is the witness page that they would have used. And that is how they did it. So all of the revelations there that had, numbering, and they were sort of marked up, and they would have known what those were. We followed their pattern, those breadcrumbs back to what would have been what's called the proposed sixth gathering. So this particular part, I'm not going to get into too much, but it is not a transcription. It is basically the best guess about where the verses would have been, where the punctuation would have been, and so forth. So that is just a little offering and a little essay at the end, an appendix to the Revelations and Translations series. So there you go. That is part 1. Our next part, we're going to get into 5 meetings. I'm going to be skimming over those as fast as I can, plus William Smith's license as a teacher in the Aaronic priesthood and Doctrine and Covenants, section 66. So stay with us.